humanity, specifically mankind or man, has pillaged and plundered the earth. But Gaia explains that she has not seen God. And so the Spectre goes to hell and interacts with Lord Shaitan and other demons who tell him that Lucifer has gone on holiday, but they haven't seen God here in the underworld. And so the Spectre returns to Earth and encounters Lucifer, who has taken human form and is lounging on the beach. And Lucifer says to the Spectre, hey, look, if I kidnapped God, I'd take credit for it. But I'm telling you, I didn't do it. So the Spectre says, yes, I believe you. The Spectre even goes so far as to travel to Apocalypse and finds that Darkseid has nothing to do with the disappearance of God. And so in his frustration, the Spectre travels to a cemetery and commands the dead to rise from their graves and explain where their creator has gone. And those who have risen from their graves have been dead for so long, they have no concept of life anymore. The concept of a God is beyond them. And it's at this point that Corrigan separates himself entirely from the Spectre by his own will and says to the Spectre, okay, don't you think that's enough? They have no idea what's happened. Let them go back to the rest. And the Spectre does that. And Corrigan looks at the Spectre and says, so, this is what it has come to. We're essentially the same being, but our two halves have become so distinct, so in discord with each other that we're able to separate ourselves without any outside interference. What is this? And the Spectre appeals to Jim and says, please, we agreed that in our search for God, we will put aside our differences. Let us be one again and continue our search. And Jim says, very well. And they become one again. But this is pretty significant because earlier in this run, we've seen Corrigan and the Spectre be separated, but it was due to external forces. And now they've just become so diametrically opposed that they don't need any external forces to separate. Well, they return to the home of Richard Kramer, whose hands are badly burned and are heavily bandaged. And Spectre transforms into Corrigan and says, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I know I'm not deserving of your forgiveness. But Kramer, who is ever the forgiving one, gives his forgiveness to Jim and asks him to explain what has been happening. And Jim tells him, and Kramer says, well, you say that you were able to separate from each other earlier. Perhaps you should do that again. And so they do, in front of Kramer. And Kramer says, perhaps in order to find God, you need to look into each other's very being and learn about each other's true nature. And perhaps that will help you find God. And so they do that. And so we see Jim looking at the origin of the Spectre force. And here, unlike the way it was portrayed in issue number 0, here we see Michael taking, I'd say, rather grim and cruel pleasure in thrusting the wrath of God into Astar and making Astar forget all that he was, all of who he was. And that makes Corrigan very upset. And he says, Spectre, how can you be a just being when the very act of your creation was unjust? And then we see the Spectre looking into Jim Corrigan's childhood. And we see the love between Jim and his best friend, Rafe. And we see the pain that Jim had to go through, the daily beatings from his father. We see how deeply it hurt Jim when Rafe and his mother were cast out of Corrigan's home, and we learn that Rafe died in the night. And so the Spectre now asks, Jim Corrigan, how can you be a just person when so much of your life was unjust? And we get this great image of Jim Corrigan, first as a boy, raising his arms in defiance, crying, "Where is the justice?" And then we see Jim as a hard-boiled detective, again, shaking his fists in the air, screaming, "Where is the justice?" And then all goes black. And we see the Archangel Michael. He's been eviscerated. He's bleeding profusely. And the Spectre is there saying, "My God, what's going on?" And finally the Spectre comes face to face with God. And he looks slovenly. And he looks wizened. Clearly this is a very ill, very tormented God. And Michael explains that God devoured everything within heaven. All the souls he consumed. And Michael explains that because he is an aspect of God, if God chooses to consume Michael, then that is God's will. And God here is presented as this entirely slovenly creature who delights in feeding upon his creation. And it disgusts the Spectre as he calls out God and asks God where he was when humanity cried out. And God responds, "Well, you're an aspect of me, Spectre. You were supposed to be there. In fact, I chained a book of judgment to you as a result of your earlier offenses. I tasked you with writing in this book of judgment. And let's see how well you've done. Where is this book of judgment I chained to you?" And the Spectre produces it from his chest. It is indeed chained to his core. So even in the final issues, Ostrander-Mandrake pull another rabbit out of their hat and take another piece of pre-crisis history, this time Silver Age history, and tie it into this beautiful tapestry which they've written before. Because, of course, the Book of Judgment was introduced back in the penultimate issue of the first volume of the Spectre. Many a reader never knew or probably even forgot about this concept, and here it is being weaved in near the end of the Ostrander-Mandrake run. And so God looks through it and says, yes, that's some interesting work which you have done. But still, God is unfettered, and both Jim and the Spectre are quite perturbed by this. And then we see God transform into Jim's father. And not only that, Jim finds himself living his father's life at various points. We're transported to sometime after the American Civil War, and Grandpa and Grandma Corrigan appear as these wraith-like husks. And Grandma Corrigan explains that sometime after the Civil War, Grandpa Corrigan and his friends raided a Native American camp. And while Grandpa Corrigan plundered the Native Americans' belongings, his friends killed the natives. And so the Spectre appeared and killed Grandpa Corrigan's friends, and then turned a finger to Grandpa Corrigan and said, "You have committed the act of theft, but you haven't committed the act of murder. Therefore, I won't end your life. However, at some point, I will take something away from you." And this stayed with Grandpa Corrigan and damaged him emotionally, psychologically. And so Grandma Corrigan explains to Father Corrigan that all Corrigan men are tainted by evil, and so she must beat the fear of sin into her son. She must beat the very sin out of her boy. And as Father Corrigan grows, he beats himself out of fear of God, of the fear of retribution. However, he becomes a very lustful person himself, and he commits acts of carnal knowledge with various women. And he goes home at night and he beats himself and prays for forgiveness. And he becomes that fire and brimstone preacher who his son Jim comes to hate. And even as he goes from town to town preaching the fear of sin and beating the fear of God into his son, he is still a very lustful person himself. And here we get confirmation of what we knew all along, but Jim didn't. Rafe is not just Jim's best friend, he's also Jim's half-brother. And so this very violent vision or dream experience that Jim has comes to an end, and he looks at his father eye to eye, and he says, "You know, old man, I hated you. I thought that you were evil, and now I realize that you're not evil. You are deeply flawed, yes, deeply scarred, but you carried a lot of pain within you. You know what, old man? I don't hate you anymore. I forgive you." And we see Father Corrigan transform back into God. He still looks wizened, but he looks humbled. And Corrigan looks at God and says, "And you know what, old man? I see that you're deeply flawed too, and you're not perfect. But I forgive you too." And then all becomes light, and Jim finds himself back in Father Kramer's home. And Father Kramer says, "Well, what happened?" And Jim says, "My God, Father, I think I killed God." And Father Kramer smiles and says, "No, Jim, God is still alive." And Jim says, "No, Father, please, don't humor me. Don't tease me." And Father Kramer says, "No, Jim, I'm not. God is still alive. The sun is shining. The birds are smiling. God is alive. You didn't kill God. You simply killed your perception of God." And this is a really interesting statement by Ostrander-Mandrake, because here it's suggesting that the way they have presented concepts of God and heaven don't have to be taken literally. In other words, following their run, future writers, creative teams could dial back the Christian themes that were presented here in this run. They could take things back to the way they were prior to the start of the run, in which the voice was just that, a disembodied voice, and that the Spectre was the agent of this disembodied voice, who one could presume to be the Christian God. So really nice, and that Ostrander was saying to future writers, okay, you're not beholden to what I have established here. You can take the Spectre in a new direction. And certainly James de Matteis, during his time writing the Spectre, would come pretty close to following what Ostrander and Mandrake were doing here in this run. But certainly things would get dialed back during the Crispus Allen era of the Spectre. But really nice that Ostrander and Mandrake were saying, okay, folks, here's what we have given you. You can take of it what we will, but we're putting some of the toys back into the toy box and leaving things open for a different interpretation in the next chapter of the Spectre's history. And so with this, Jim Corrigan appears quite tired, and he sighs as best a ghost can sigh, and he says, Padre, I'm so tired. I just want it to end. What can I do to get my rest? And folks, clearly there's going to be a part 8 coming your way. I'll release it next week, in which we'll look at the funeral and the final goodbye to Jim Corrigan. Until another 7 days have come and gone, this class is, for one last time, in recess.